What's going on, everyone? In today's episode, we've got some seeds to start, but we're not starting those seeds because if you watch this channel, you probably would have already seen us starting those seeds. We got some herbs, we got some flowers, we got some peppers that we already are starting. But in today's episode, I'm going to be breaking down seed starting tips and mistakes that I see a lot of you making because I know a lot of you are new to this. I've put out my feelers on Facebook and Instagram, and I've seen that about 40% of our viewers are new first-time gardeners. That's awesome. That is a huge amount. And I can contribute that to the fact that gardening is only becoming more popular. But one thing that I want you to do is to have success when seed starting, because yeah, if you go out to the greenhouse or the garden center and you buy plants, that's fine, that's awesome. But if you can start your own seeds, you're not only gonna have the satisfaction of saying, I grew that from a seed, from start to finish, but it also helps you save a ton of money and opens up a whole other world of options that you have at your disposal. You're no longer gonna say, well, there's only 3 options of tomatoes. You can start thousands of varieties of tomatoes. No longer are you gonna have 2 varieties of peppers. You're gonna have hundreds of varieties of peppers to choose from. And so starting from seed is so rewarding, saves a ton of money, and allows you to grow something that you are going to love. So let's jump on into some of these tips and mistakes that I see you guys making. First tip and mistake, heat mats. Heat mats can be a wonderful resource to help you sprout your seeds faster. If your seeds, like in the case of our pepper seeds here that we're gonna be starting, pepper seeds can take up to 2 weeks to germinate. And so if you throw them on a heat mat, that heat mat is gonna warm the soil and help them to germinate faster. But I would caution you on leaving your heat mat on too long. A lot of gardeners make the mistake of leaving their heat mat on well after their seeds have already germinated. Once you already have 1 or 2 sprouts showing up in your trays, turn your heat mat off or remove them from the heat. They no longer need it and they don't want it. A lot of times what can happen if you leave your heat mat on too long is it's going to dry the soil out too fast, but also those plants don't like the heat. And when they don't like the heat, they're going to try to flee from it. And that's where you start to get leggy seedlings. Legginess is just, it's stress being shown in the plant. Often either the plant is stretching for light or it's stretching away from heat or dry soil. It's going to start to stretch. And once they start to stretch, you can't fix it. Next tip I got for you guys when seed starting is use a UV resistant marker. At the end of the day, you're going to want something that will not fade in the light. A lot of times I've turned to using something like a Sharpie or a pen to mark my labels. The downside to using a Sharpie or a pen is that they'll fade. They'll fade when you water, they'll fade in the sun, and then you're gonna end up, especially if you're a first-time gardener. Even for me, I have a hard time noticing, knowing what I planted where, because I might plant, like in my case, I'm planting 7 different varieties of peppers right now. Well, they're all gonna look like peppers. And so yeah, I know I planted a pepper, but what is what? And so having this is such a tool. This is something that we have used. We also carry it over at MIgardener.com. It's a UV resistant marker, and it honestly is a lifesaver. It doesn't fade, and oftentimes it lasts the whole season before it even starts to think about fade even a little bit. So get yourself one of these, you'll thank me later. All right, third tip, as well as a caution for some of you beginning gardeners, is starting varieties that all sprout at the same time and grow at the same rate. You see these peppers here, they're all gonna sprout right around the same time, 1 to 2 weeks time. And then they all grow at about the same rate because they're all peppers. Now, the reason why I'm doing that is because of the fact that when they germinate, I don't want to create shadows. One of the biggest mistakes I see gardeners making is taking a tray and putting in broccoli, lettuce, tomatoes, peppers. They start their whole garden in one little tray. What happens inevitably is you're going to have the broccoli, which grows real fast. And the broccoli grows up super fast and gets big and leafy. Well, just next door, you've got lettuce. Well, that poor lettuce, it's gonna be this tall by the time the broccoli is this tall. What's gonna happen? It's gonna shade it out, it's gonna smother it. And you're gonna end up with really patchy growth. You're gonna end up with stuff that's thriving and other stuff that's really just barely surviving. And so if you're going to do that, if you're gonna have one tray, if you only have one light to grow under, create some space. There's plenty of space here where you can take 2 cells, leave them empty, and then plant out those next 2 cells with something else that sprouts at a slightly different rate and grows at a slightly different rate. Nothing wrong with that. Just don't buddy them up. back to back to back to back. Otherwise, you're definitely gonna have problems. And I can speak from experience. I made that same mistake where I grew bush beans, which, oh man, most, biggest rookie mistake of them all. I planted bush beans, which sprout in like 3 to 4 days, and they get massive right off the bat. And I planted them right next to my tomatoes. And I had tomatoes the second year I was starting seeds. And those poor tomatoes just got flattened by those beans. And so it was a big mistake, definitely learned my lesson. And ultimately it helped me to not make the same mistake again. And it allows me to teach you something that you might not know. So start stuff that is of similar germination, as well as if you only have a certain amount of space, just give them a little space in between. A little 1-2 inch buffer is all it takes so that they kind of, face to face, leave some space. Next tip I got for you is don't be afraid to start more than 1 seed per cell. A lot of times gardeners, they look at their cells as if it's this defined space that can't be modified at all once seeds start growing. You can modify, and that's through thinning. You see, if you only plant 1 seed, you have to have 100% germination. And let me give you a little tip. You're never gonna have 100% germination. Well, never expected, right? Even as a seed seller, we sell seeds. We sell over almost 800 varieties of vegetable seeds. None of our seeds we advertise as 100% germination because that's just unrealistic. Does it happen from time to time? Absolutely. We certainly hear stories of that happening, and that's great. That's 2 green thumbs up. We love to hear that. But realistically, you're gonna have something like 90 to 85% germination. That means out of 100 seeds, 10 to 15 won't sprout, and that's realistic. So if you have 1 seed only in 1 cell, okay, maybe start a few more cells to account for that if you have the space. But if you don't have the space and you have just 1 grow light and 1 little flat to put underneath that grow light, you need to maximize that space. And that is where I would say it is worth putting 2 or even 3 seeds per cell, even if they're as small as these cells, because at the end of the day, you can take some snips and you can snip out the less healthy of the 2 or 3 that sprout. You also can pull them out and separate them out, and then you have 3 plants for the price of 1. But it guarantees you that something is going to sprout there, because the odds of 1 seed not sprouting in that 1 cell is actually pretty high. You're gonna have, out of 10 rows here, you're gonna have 1 or 2 that won't sprout, because that's the averages, right? That's what you're up against. Whereas if you have 20 cells, you're still gonna have maybe 3 to 4 cells that won't germinate. But if you have 2 or 3 seeds in each cell, for sure, you're gonna have a seedling in every single one of those cells, and that means you're gonna be maximizing this space to the best of your capabilities. Next tip I got for you is when you're starting your seeds, make sure you start enough of them. Now this is also a big mistake, and it's something that a lot of gardeners don't really think about. But when you have your garden, you wanna think about your garden as a whole. Yes, it is very nice to have some plants growing. But if it's not enough, then once you plant out your garden, it's sometimes too late to start more seeds. And I can't tell you how frustrating, because again, speaking from experience, I didn't start enough my first few gardens. And what happened was I'd plant out my garden and I have a bunch of space left over, but no time to start more seeds. Like in the case of these peppers, you need 6 to 10 weeks before your last frost date. Well, if you're planting them out in the garden, and you realize, well, shoot, I'm 30 plants short. Maybe I'll just start some more. There's no way there's gonna be enough time to get those plants up and growing and then, producing adequate amounts of fruit to make it worth your time. What you're gonna have to do is you're gonna have to go to the greenhouse or garden center and buy more plants. And then you're spending a bunch of money when you were right there. You were kissing success. It was just like right at your fingertips. You just didn't plant enough. So planning. Plan ahead, know the space of your garden, know how many plants will fit in that space, and plant accordingly. Generally, we overplant. And the reason why we do that is because it gives us the capability to grow more than we're gonna need, so that then we can get picky. We can say, well, you're not as healthy as you are, I'm gonna pick you and not you, and then we can take those lesser healthy plants and we could say, okay, here, you don't have a garden, here's a free plant. May not be the best plant in the world, but it's a free plant. And who's gonna turn up a nose to a free plant? Also, if there's extra space, you find out later on, well, hey, bonus plants, right? Bonus plants are great, but not having enough, that really stinks. All right, next tip for you is keep plants that grow really fast and really big to outdoors. Now you can start them indoors if you have tons of space and you know what you're doing, but oftentimes gardeners try to start everything indoors because that's what a lot of gardeners are conditioned to think, that it's natural to start everything indoors before your last frost date, when you don't really have to do that. Prime example, my bean story. First year garden, first time I was starting seeds for my garden indoors, I started beans. Beans, you can start them indoors if you've got tons of space, but more often than not, most people don't have the space to afford for a bean plant. Beans, the moment they sprout, they are this tall. Then the moment they form adult leaves, they're this wide. I mean, beans are just not very realistic to start indoors. You can, but you could just direct sow them outside and they're gonna do just as fine. Same thing with things like sunflowers, squash. Those plants get giant. We have started them indoors as well once we understand the needs that, their needs to grow. They have special needs, and those needs are space. When a squash plant grows, it's gonna be this tall right off the bat. Then the first set of adult leaves are gonna be like this. Again, you're talking tons of space being taken up. And oftentimes, as beginning gardeners, we don't have that much space, and they would do totally fine with enough time in our growing season if they were just directly started outdoors. Another mistake I see gardeners making are planting things that just don't transplant well. If you have things like carrots and root crops don't transplant well, start them directly in the soil. If you take a carrot seedling and you transplant it out into the garden, the moment you damage that carrot's taproot, that will prevent a carrot from ever forming. You're gonna end up with a really stubby, gnarly, very rooty, kind of alien looking carrot. It will not look like a nice carrot. Start them directly out in the garden, you'll thank me later. If this whole tray was corn, it may be enough. I say may, asterisks, air quotes, may be enough, because that's assuming every seed is gonna germinate. And then you have to transplant them before those seeds become root bound, which they grow really fast. And then once you put them out in the garden, you need a square of around 60 plants to have proper pollination. This is 120 cells. That means that this is 120 potential corn plants. Corn has around 70% germination. So automatically you're gonna take 70% of those plants and you're gonna erase them out of the category because they're not gonna germinate. Then from there, you have to, what's left has to survive, be healthy, and be transplanted in order to actually have them produce. When you could literally just take the seeds, throw them in the ground, throw some mesh over top so squirrels and birds don't get to them if you're worried about that, or start 25, 30% more seeds than you really need. Then after they have their snack, you still have enough plants. They do so much better just outdoors. Don't start them indoors. You'll thank me later. All right, we're gonna rifle through the last two here. Last tip is make sure when you have cell packs like this, or even small cells like this, make sure you understand how your soil behaves. Now, it might seem a little bit weird. This soil isn't misbehaving. Well, it can misbehave because it can look dry on top, but if you tip it upside down, there's lots of moisture in there. The top of the soil will always dry out faster than down below. And a lot of times gardeners will overwater their plants because they think their soil is dry. Yes, the top is dry. That's fine. There's plenty of water down in the pot here. You need to take time to understand how your soil behaves, whether it dries out fast or slow, the time that it takes for it to dry out to the point where you need to rewater. Otherwise, you're gonna be rewatering at a time when it doesn't need more water, and then you're gonna be overwatering. And that leads to dampening off, that leads to rot, mold, fungus issues, lots of problems. And ultimately, it also can lead to poor root development, which leads to dependency on water later on, where no matter what you do, they're always just screaming, water me, because their roots are really small because you've given them too much water. Let your soil dry out, and that takes some inspection and time to get to know your soil. Final mistake, I would say, kind of has to do with watering, and that's humidity domes. I, under no circumstances, recommend humidity domes unless you're someone taking cuttings. The rosemary behind us, we took cuttings. They needed humidity for the foliage to not dry out. When you're starting seeds, it can help a little bit keep the soil dry, or keep the soil damp, I should say. But what happens is if you water your soil on a regular basis, that water never leaves the soil, and then you end up with things like damping off, mold, rot, and your problems. And a lot of gardeners don't understand the right time to pull off their humidity dome. So I think that's just about everything. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you all learned something new. If you did, make sure to hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. We have so much more gardening information coming out, and I just want to help you guys. I want to help you have more fun, learn more, enjoy in the garden, that much more. I hope you guys enjoyed, and as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow big or go home.